Welcome in. It is fantastic to have you joining us today. We have a genuinely mind-bending deep dive custom tailored just for you. You send us an incredibly rich stack of material spanning deep historical analyses, international legal theories, and some rigorously researched alternate history papers. And our mission today is to explore a monumental what-if scenario. What if the Indigenous Australian societies had formed a large-scale, coordinated political and military alliance against European colonization?
It's just a phenomenal premise. We are looking at a complete reimagining of modern history, but built entirely on the actual documented capabilities of pre-colonial Indigenous societies. It forces us to look beyond the localized skirmishes of the frontier wars and really model out a continent-wide confederacy.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really appreciate this alternate timeline, we need to establish our point of divergence. We all know the historical reality of the first fleet arriving in 1788, right? The Australian continent wasn't a blank slate. It was home to over 500 distinct nations and over 250 languages.
Right. And while resistance absolutely did happen, the historical reality is that it was largely localized. What the historical models you provided ask us to do is pivot right there in the 1790s.
Exactly. Instead of individual nations fighting these isolated guerrilla campaigns, Indigenous leaders recognize the existential continent-wide threat. And rather than fighting alone, they leverage their pre-existing transcontinental networks to mobilize.
And to do this justice, we are going to trace this timeline chronologically today. We will examine the mechanics of this initial mobilization, how a unified command could actually function across such a vast landmass, and then from there we will analyze the execution of a coordinated continental war, the resulting international legal battles over sovereignty, and finally the post-war governance structure of a newly forged Australian state.
The logistics of that initial mobilization are what immediately caught my attention in your sources. The machinery for a continental alliance wasn't something they would have had to invent from scratch. It was already there.
It was already operational.
Yeah, a prime example being the song lines. I mean, these weren't just spiritual pathways. The historical analyses detail them as an 80,000-year-old transcontinental intelligence network. There is a documented 3,500-kilometer route connecting the Central Desert directly to the East Coast. This is essentially a living map.
What is crucial to understand here is how these songlines function as corridors of encrypted knowledge. They were mnemonic devices tied inextricably to geography, encoded with critical survival data, water sources, and diplomatic protocols.
So if a messenger traveled along a songline into another nation's territory, they demonstrated their knowledge of local law by singing the appropriate verses.
Precisely. It was an ancient, highly sophisticated highway system designed for the rapid transmission of information and culture.
And traveling those highways were the messengers carrying message sticks. The papers you shared describe these intricately carved pieces of wood, almost like cryptographic diplomatic passports. Holding the correct message stick verified the messenger's authority and granted safe passage across rigid geopolitical borders.
When we look at the pure mathematics of this logistical network, it completely upends conventional assumptions about communication speed in the 18th century. The models highlight a specific logistical formula regarding transit speed. An indigenous relay system utilizing dual runners, represented in the data as V relay, would significantly outpace a single British horseman, or V-horse.
Especially in the Australian terrain, because the British cavalry was restricted by the need for fodder, water, and relatively flat ground, right? They hit these geographical choke points.
Exactly, because a horse cannot navigate dense mangrove swamps or scale steep sandstone escarpments. They can't push through thick scrub without massive delays. Relay runners, operating light and utilizing geographic shortcuts known only to them, could bypass those bottlenecks entirely.
So because of this logistical superiority, news of the First Fleet dropping anchor at Botany Bay could theoretically reach nations 700 kilometers away in a matter of days.
Vastly outstripping the British capacity to even map their immediate surroundings, yes.
I was looking at the logistics of this, and the language barrier seems like an insurmountable hurdle at first glance. You have over 250 distinct languages across the continent. But the sociological notes on fractal politics and the Aidskin subsection system suggest this was already a solved problem.
It bypassed the language barrier entirely because it acted as a universal social grammar. The skin system is a structural masterpiece. The term fractal politics refers to how the micro-level family unit perfectly mirrored the macro-level continental structure.
So it categorized the social and natural worlds so effectively that a warrior from the western desert could travel thousands of kilometers to the Sydney Basin and instantly know their precise kinship relation to the local leadership.
That is exactly how it worked. They wouldn't need to speak the same language to know exactly who was a designated brother, uncle, or trading partner. The structure of mutual obligation was identical.
Which allows for immediate socio-political integration. Your materials suggest this is the mechanism that would have enabled the rapid formation of a Grand Council of Elders. They would utilize yarning, this highly structured, culturally embedded method for rigorous consensus building, to coordinate a unified strategic response.
And structurally, that pre-existing unity neutralizes the classic imperial tactic of divide and rule. Historically, the British exploited local linguistic and territorial rivalries to establish things like the native police. But under a unified Grand Council, governed by a universally recognized code of continental loyalty, that infiltration becomes impossible.
The colonial forces are suddenly facing an impenetrable united front. Which brings us to the actual fighting. Here's where it gets really interesting. Looking at the military execution, the papers completely reframe the tactical balance of the era.
They really do. We all know the limitations of the 18th century smoothbore musket. It's heavy, it's highly susceptible to misfires in damp conditions, and it is practically useless beyond 50 meters.
Right, but what your alternate history papers highlight is how a unified Indigenous command would have systematically exploited that slow reload time. They contrast the rigid, linear European firing lines with the highly mobile, decentralized use of the Woomera.
The Woomera acts as a third lever in the human arm, providing tremendous kinetic energy. In the hands of a skilled warrior, it essentially functioned as a force multiplier. It gave Indigenous skirmishers a superior rate of fire and lethal enfilading accuracy up to 200 meters.
200 meters versus 50. That is a massive technological advantage in early engagements. A mobilized unit could unleash a devastating overlapping field of fire and vanish into the bushline before a British regiment could even prime their flashbangs.
And in this timeline, we aren't just talking about opportunistic hit-and-run attacks. We are looking at a central command scaling up asymmetrical warfare. The historical records highlight leaders like Pemulwuy, the Bidjigal resistance leader who was known as a Carity or a clever man.
Yeah, a clever man possessed immense spiritual, medical, and legal authority. In our unified scenario, a confederacy of these clever men functions essentially as a strategic intelligence bureau.
They wouldn't merely coordinate troop movements. They would architect highly sophisticated psychological warfare. Historical accounts note the profound, paralyzing fear the British had of Pemulwuy. There are persistent rumors among the colonists that he was impervious to bullets or could transform into a bird to escape prison.
So a coordinated campaign, leveraging that kind of psychological dread, would create a literal contagion of fear along the frontier. And compounding that psychological advantage is their ultimate strategic redoubt, the dead heart of the Australian interior.
The British supply lines were already stretched thin just surviving on the coast. The Indigenous alliance could utilize the interior as an impenetrable logistical fortress. They could train elite units, integrate captured firearms, and plan counteroffensives, knowing the British military could never successfully march an army into the arid center.
Furthermore, their doctrine wouldn't rely solely on kinetic military engagements. It would extend heavily into economic area denial, the targeted application of fire stick farming.
Right. Traditionally, this is an intricate method of environmental management used to promote biodiversity and mitigate catastrophic bushfires. But the tactical models show the alliance weaponizing this practice on a continental scale.
By systematically burning off the pastures, the alliance aggressively targets the exact resources the colonial infrastructure requires. The British pastoral economy was entirely dependent on those specific park-like grasslands to graze their sheep and cattle.
When you combine the scorched earth elimination of fodder with the tactical deployment of dingoes to continuously harass, exhaust, and scatter livestock, you completely dismantle the agricultural base. Without a functioning pastoral economy, the colony faces immediate logistical overextension and starvation.
The sources also brought up this speculative regional coalition that I found fascinating, the Sunfire Brotherhood concept. It introduces a completely different geopolitical variable into this conflict.
Yes. In the Northwest, Afro-Malay Makasan traders have been interacting with indigenous populations for centuries. In this timeline, the materials map out an alliance that blends Aboriginal martial traditions with decentralized Islamic military doctrine introduced by those trade networks.
You have units wielding scimitar-style blades forged in the outback, operating in highly autonomous cell commands.
And the geopolitical ramifications of a highly organized, heavily armed force like the Sunfire Brotherhood are profound. If the British Empire is bogged down in a protracted, unwinnable conflict against an advanced indigenous confederacy, it broadcasts a clear signal of imperial weakness.
Which transforms the continent from a quiet penal outpost into a fiercely contested global frontier. Observers from rival empires, perhaps the French who harbored Pacific ambitions, or later an imperializing Japan, might actively recognize the indigenous confederacy.
They could supply them with advanced armaments purely to bleed British resources, which forces a massive legal pivot. If the British are facing an internationally recognized, organized military confederacy, they can no longer rely on the doctrine of terra nullius.
Right, the legal fiction, the land belonged to no one because there was no recognizable sovereign government. That whole claim just falls apart.
Exactly. That is the crux of the jurisprudential battlefield here. During the late 18th century, international law was heavily dictated by Imre de Vattel's 1758 treatise, The Law of Nations,
which was the prevailing international legal framework of the era.
Yes, and Vattel explicitly defined a sovereign state as a political body united for mutual safety and advantage. Crucially, his framework allowed that independent states could unite into a perpetual confederacy and still retain recognition as a perfect sovereign entity.
Meaning that if this Grand Council of Elders steps forward, representing a federal republic bound by the intricate legal framework of a shared dreaming law, they perfectly meet the strict European definitions of a sovereign state. Dreaming law isn't categorized as mere myth. It is presented as a complex constitutional framework governing land tenure, dispute resolution, and resource allocation. Terra nullius is legally obliterated.
This raises an important question. If the legal justification of empty land collapses under Vattel's framework, what is the new legal relationship? The British would be forced to abandon the legal claim of occupation and formally negotiate a treaty of cession.
We see structural parallels for this elsewhere in the British Empire, where indigenous populations presented a unified, insurmountable resistance. In New Zealand, it necessitated the Treaty of Waitangi. In North America, the 1763 Royal Proclamation legally recognized that land remained under Aboriginal title until formally ceded by treaty.
The British administration would have to interact with the indigenous leadership, not as domestic subjects to be policed, but as sovereign international allies through a formal Department of Foreign Relations.
That completely shifts the balance of power and leads us right into the post-war reality. Once a treaty is ratified, what does the governance structure of this new Australian state actually look like? The constitutional models point toward a nations of nations framework, specifically referencing two-way governance.
It operates similarly to the Maori King movement, or Kingatanga, utilizing a dual administration system. You would see the establishment of vast, reserved territories where customary dreaming law remains the absolute supreme jurisdictional authority, functioning parallel to European common law in the designated settlement zones.
I was particularly struck by the epidemiological analysis of this post-war state in your materials. Historically, we know the single most devastating factor for indigenous populations wasn't the musket. It was the introduction of foreign pathogens. But a sovereign alliance with recognized borders has the jurisdictional authority to enact strict biosecurity measures.
Yes, the papers detail how traditional welcome-to-country boundary protocols could have been rapidly adapted into an epidemiological firewall. It is a brilliant adaptation of existing cultural infrastructure. They already possessed protocols for managing the safe integration of strangers. By converting those into rigid quarantine zones at the coastal frontiers, they control the influx of disease.
Furthermore, holding immense economic leverage, the Grand Council could negotiate for European medical knowledge as a strict condition of trade. The model specifically mentions smallpox variolation.
Right, the early practice of inoculating individuals with live virus to build immunity. A sovereign state could execute a massive public health campaign to variolate their populations, entirely preventing the horrific demographic collapse we saw historically.
With the population demographics largely intact, the cultural and linguistic preservation is unparalleled. Imagine traveling to this alternate Australia today. You would have over 250 indigenous languages functioning not just as heritage languages, but thriving as official state languages.
The national broadcasting networks, the diplomatic corps, and the high courts would be operating in a vibrant, multilingual ecosystem. It creates a fundamentally different civilizational ethos, shifting the entire geopolitical identity of the continent.
Instead of functioning as an isolated European outpost in the Pacific, This unified Australian Confederacy emerges as a uniquely relationalist power in the Indo-Pacific.
The geopolitical models describe this outcome as multipolarity with Aboriginal characteristics. Because the foundational dreaming law is intrinsically tied to interdependent ecological relationships, their foreign policy naturally prioritizes long-term environmental stewardship and cooperative regional stability over aggressive, unilateral expansion.
It is a fascinating lens through which to view geopolitics.
Yeah.
And to bring this right back to you, the listener, in the present day, while this deep dive has explored an alternate historical timeline, the underlying themes are incredibly current. The concept of sovereign convergence, this drive for a unified, legally recognized indigenous jurisdiction, is a live, ongoing project right now.
It is, and the modern efforts toward truth-telling, treaty, and constitutional recognition are continuations of this exact same resistance and desire for a recognized, shared sovereignty.
And as a quick reminder to you listening, our goal here isn't to take any sort of political stance on modern debates. Whether we are looking at left-wing or right-wing commentary on these issues, we are strictly acting as impartial guides. We are just reporting on how the provided materials connect this historical what-if to the ongoing conversations happening today.
Absolutely. The historical analyses provided treat these modern debates objectively, illustrating that the historical desire for a recognized Indigenous jurisdiction remains the central, unresolved jurisprudential question of the modern Australian state.
I want to thank you again for providing such a rich, thought-provoking stack of sources for this deep dive. It really pushes the boundaries of how we think about statehood in history.
And to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over, imagine how this alternate, relationalist Australian superpower might have uniquely responded to the modern global climate crisis.
Oh, that is a massive question.
If an entire continent's governance was legally bound to the ecological principles of the dreaming and 80,000 years of sustainable land management, how might that massive geopolitical influence have shifted the entire world's approach to industrialization and environmental policy throughout the 20th and 21st centuries?
So what does this all mean? It means history is never as inevitable as it seems in retrospect. Keep questioning those historical assumptions, keep looking for the alternate angles, and please bring us another stack of material for your next deep dive. We will see you then.